Hello, welcome to the Conférence pour le Brésil. This is our first edition. Antes de começar, gostaríamos de lembrar ao nosso público que o painel com áudio ao vivo em inglês está disponível em nosso canal no YouTube. My name is Felipe Lauritzen. I am the co-founder and one of the co-presidents of Conférence pour le Brésil, together with Vinicius Hayes and Vivian Kawanami, on behalf of all of our organizing team of 15 students and alumni from Sciences Po Paris. I would like to thank everyone for watching our panel on elections and the institutions. This conference is organized by us here at Sciences Po and has its central theme overcoming inequalities. 10 years for the Sustainable Development Goals, 13 panels and more than 50 speakers distributed over 7 weeks, always on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Brazil, and on Tuesdays at 3 p.m. in Brazil. In addition to the tireless and voluntary work of our team, we thank our partners from the TD Setúbal Foundation, Latin American Political Observatory of Sciences Po, Headline and Educa Libras. They are the ones who allow us to create a free online event with simultaneous interpreting into English, Portuguese, and Brazilian Sign Language. This year of 2020, we'll have the municipal elections. They will take place in November. That is 2 weeks from now. It's a very important moment of our democracy, which is precisely the moment when ourselves, the citizens, have to choose our representatives. Those people who are going to make the most important public life decisions that affect us every day. There are some decisions that even determine how much inequality we'll have in our country, since inequalities are in some ways a political decision. So in order to fight against them, we need to choose representatives who place this objective as the guiding principle of our public policies. And it considers several other challenges facing Brazil's democracy today, and Conférence pour le Brésil decided to bring this panel's on elections and institutions. For this reason, we understood that the mechanisms by which we choose our political representatives and the institutions in which these agents operate, and these are fundamental in the fight against inequalities. With that in mind, I am delighted to invite José Eduardo Cardozo, a jurist and university professor, to this panel today, who has a deep knowledge of the institutions that make up our democracy. Cardozo has already worked with the 3 branches of the Republic as a Minister of Justice from 2011 to 2016. In 2016, when he was elected for the Municipality House of Representatives in the city of São Paulo for 2 consecutive terms between 1995 and 2002, and also as a federal deputy for the state of São Paulo between 2003 and 2011, and 2 consecutive terms as a court administration with brilliant performance. In addition to Minister Cardozo, we are delighted to welcome Nina Santos, who is a great researcher in the area of democracy and technology. Nina she's a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Science and Technology in Digital Democracy, as well as associate researcher at the University of Paris. Nina's doctoral thesis verses about the use of Twitter in Brazilian political environment during the 2013 protests. Our third panelist is Professor Cláudio Ferraz, who does a brilliant job monitoring and evaluating public policies. Cláudio is a professor of economics at the University of British Columbia and a professor at PUC in Rio. He's an economist for the University of Costa Rica, an MA from Boston University, and a PhD from Berkeley University of California. In addition, Claudio is the scientific director of JPAL for Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you very much for being here with us. It's a pleasure. I am very honored to be able to moderate this debate with such brilliant people. And I would like to thank you on behalf of our entire team and on behalf of Sciences Po for your participation in this panel. I thank you as well. Thank you. In an ideal democracy, people would have equal conditions to run for elections and also equal conditions to participate in political life through voting. But we know it does not happen this way. The system, which was designed so that each person represents a single voice, ends up being replaced by a system in which a person with a lot of money is able to represent many voices. Looking not only to Brazil, but looking at the world, we see that the escalation of money, we see the escalation of money used in electoral processes. Great billionaires around the world making lavish donations to political candidates who defend their agenda, as well as some of those billionaires entering politics themselves. Brazil has made important reforms in the recent years to improve electoral system. It has put an end to party coalitions. It has imposed performances clauses to parties. It has banned campaign financing by companies. And it has set campaigns expenditure limits and created an electoral fund, which has been very positive. Claudio has already written many nice articles on the effects on these reforms on the Brazilian electoral funding system. One of the important gains that the reform brought was regarding the political competition, which became more intense. This is Claudio. Claudio, with this in mind, I'd like to ask you, what were the main advances that we had in the Brazilian electoral funding system in recent years? And how do you evaluate the current system? If you could include in your response, is there room for improvement of the system? But uh, before I move on, the audience, please, you can ask questions in the comment section on Twitter and on Facebook and on YouTube, and then we are going to answer some of the questions at the end of the debate. So, Claudio, you have the floor. Well, thank you, Felipe. I'd like to start by thanking for including me in this event. It's a pleasure to be here. We can start by summarizing Brazil. If you start considering the 90s up until 2015, when we start with the prohibition of companies funding the elections, the role of money during the elections has increased enormously, exponentially, I'd say. If you look at a graph, you are going to see uh, you're going to understand that it's alarming the way this graph has increased its numbers. So I believe it looks very normal. It seems normal. Uh, the reforms that have the chance to decrease the use of money are hard to pass. There are three aspects that are really important. One is the prohibition of contribution by companies. The second It was to impose a limit of expenditure for the candidates. And that third element would be the one that gives me more uncertainty because it was conducted very fast. It was the not very sophisticated idea, to be honest, uh, considering that the shortest the campaign is, the best is going to be, and cheaper for Brazil it's going to be. But I would like to elaborate a little bit more. I'm an economist, and what I do during my daily life in my research is to study the connection between the politics and economy. And many times when decisions are made as far as laws are concerned, we don't think of the negative aspects of them when they are created. We don't think of the bad consequences. What I'm going to say to you here is some of the things I've been studying and my research shows, but I know from a descriptive way how things are happening. First thing that is important is the limit of expenditure with campaigns. And when we look at the previous elections, in the first election after the limit was established, has a quite positive effect if you compare the municipalities and the way things have been established. Some places had more limits, pre-established limits than others. When they compare the candidate expenditures from one election to another, you can compare and you can see these larger and shorter limits when you compare cities. When you have a more strict limit, when candidates spend less, and when you see that when there was more political competition, and something that is very important is that you end up with elected candidates, they are less rich in the end. There is one side, such reform, the good side of this, it ends up establishing that you have less possibility of expenditure, and this is positive. But one of the frustrating sides of this, and I'm going to continue carrying out this research just to find out what happens, is that you see younger candidates entering the competition, smaller parties competing for a chair, or minorities that traditionally, not population minority in politics. I mean here the Black people and women, making the campaign cheaper is facilitating their interest in the competition. So on one side, there is this good side of this story, but this alone doesn't bring any democracy in the election. So this is one side. The second thing that is important, and it's not obvious, when you look back, it's not obvious that this prohibition of company was something that is totally positive for Brazil. So there is a controversy here, and I'm studying this. But I'll tell you why. The problem is that when you first prohibit some sorts of campaign in an election in which candidates do not have money, in a short term, what you have is a massive entrance of rich candidates for the competition. You see company owners, and this is a direct effect. If you prohibit this, on one side you prohibit the use of company money, but on the other side you don't stop people from entering election. This is one thing is going to solve the problem. Yes, possibly this is not going to solve the problem at all, because what Brazil lacks and what is left behind is a party structure. When you give money to political parties, there is no restriction or no sort of accountability in the sense of political parties having to present their balance and how they use the money, or uh, a guidance for them to use the money properly. They can do anything with that money. So on one side, you prohibit the use of company money, but on the other side, you've concentrated this money of an elite inside political parties with no democratization of the use of such money. In the end, many company owners are donating as individuals because they are rich, and you have data on this because you can observe this. So in real life, you see that this indirect use and investment of money in campaigns is happening, but it's more concentrated and less transparent. And the third thing, just to start, is regarding the rules and regarding to the obligation. And the parties had to follow quotas, and the parties would have to distribute in the proportion considering women in politics.
I'm even carrying a study on that. And what the study shows is that, in fact, some parties have reacted to that and distributed their resources. We've seen many stories of uh, per se representative, but per se false candidates just representing there to uh, represent the money. But it doesn't seem to have been a big change since 2018. But now I think there's a very important discussion to be made when we have more candidates who are Black, and how the parties have to distribute the resources again. And the thing is, there is no accountability rules that make the parties responsible for how this money is distributed. So these reforms that work only on one side, many times, they generate effects that are not intentional, but that which in fact happen, where many times the parties react concentrating this money, and you don't have the democratization you would like to have with more women, more Black people there, but they can generate the opposite effect. So just to close, I think that Brazil may implemented many reforms really quickly, responding to pressure from the civil society. And some of these changes were uh, a mistake, in my opinion. Nina is going to talk more about the social media and its uh, influence in the process. But I think it has to do a lot with the short time for the campaign for this election. I'll stop right now, and I imagine we'll continue this conversation further on. We have Thank you, Cláudio, for the points you have raised. I think it's very interesting to see how the money diminished in financing political campaigns. And I want to take that point to ask Nina a question about the use of social media in elections, especially Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp, and all that. And some people defend that this technology make campaign cheaper for candidates because it removes the traditional media and traditional press from the process, and it would reduce costs. But in face of that, Nina, how do you evaluate these new technologies in Brazilian elections? And what's the relationship between these new technologies and the press in its traditional sense? And I would also like you to answer how this Brazilian government could adapt to respond to these new challenges presented by these technologies. Thank you, Felipe. I want to start before trying to answer to these questions. I want to first congratulate you for in two ways. First, for the organization of the Conférence pour le Brésil, because you're bringing several important themes for Brazil today. So I'm very happy to see an initiative like this by the students and alumni. And also, I want to congratulate you for the composition of this panel, a panel about institutions and election, because I think that when you have a participation from a point of view of communication in this panel is essential. We see many times the debates like this happening without considering communication as a central issue. And I think a panel like this, considering all these different point of views, will be very rich for our debate. So trying to answer your questions, I want to present something trying to integrate the role of social media in political debate, the role of press, and what is the impact of these transformations in the communication systems generate transformation for the acknowledgement of the legitimate uh, or not, the legitimacy or not of the elections. And to start this debate, I want to mention a research that came out last week. I don't know if you all had a chance to see it, from Pew Research Institute from the Dominican Republic. And it showed that 36% of the Americans said they trust that the most frequent uh, channels will announce the results of the election properly. This is the way the Americans consider the sources of information that they prefer to use most frequently. And 46% say they don't trust that much, but they kind of trust that this media will provide a proper coverage of the electoral process. So when you talk about this, you see that the number of those who really trust this coverage falls down to 34% and goes up to 49% among the Democrats. So I think there, what the results show us is how you build a democratic society without an information system. Because one of the results of our current information system is the fact that there is no trust. A lot of people, be it for the large number of information considered false or you can in which you can trust, and how does this relate to the traditional system of information? So when you're talking about institutions and elections, it's not only an issue related to the electoral system, legislations, party, candidates, proposals, but also of the legitimacy the citizens attribute to the information they get in electoral contexts, and the legitimacy they attribute to the actors who mediate this information. These data are is from the United States, but it reflects a situation that affects many other countries in other areas. It doesn't have to do only with the press, but there's a criticism related to the legitimacy of the institutions, the epistemic crisis we're going through. So uh, in the case of Brazil and its press, I want to focus a little bit on the issue of press versus social media. I think we can think of this situation from 2 points of view: the lack of trust on the communication system. One has to do with the way the press works properly, and the other one focus on these new actors that come up in the context of social media. So the Brazilian press works has been the source, the target of criticism for a long time, since the dictatorship, the fight against censorship, and all the demands that came up for claiming for uh, pluralism, for spreading of information, and this constant lack of representativity, of plurality in our traditional press. This is an actual problem. So this is a system that requires a complex approach. In the research I carried during the pandemics, we found that media does cover episodes of violence against Black people, but they tend to treat these episodes as isolated incidents many times so that they don't are seen as part of a big problem. For example, you to have this movement, you need external influence, such as the death of George Floyd. But when you consider Twitter and you see this addition of this isolated incidents being connected to the movement of Black Lives Matter, is much quicker in Twitter. And this affects the people, how they relate to these different media sources of information. And another observation that has precisely to do with Web 2.0, that allowed many new actors the possibility of creating information, spreading information, fake news, and all that. And it provides a huge number of information being spread without being properly verified, and you have information and lies being mixed in a more common manner. I also conducted a research recently about the consumption of sources of information, and depending on your social position and political position, the consumption of sources that are that come from official areas drops drastically when so when you have way more information coming from YouTube, for example, instead of official sources. So when you get two different political groups, in a recent research, I analyzed the discourse of Bolsonaro pro and against the pandemics. You see that there is an agreement regarding sources of information. Only 1/3 of the sources show up in the two groups. So there is a clear break in the building of this public political debate currently. There's a lack of trust information you can trust, and this is essential for our democratic health. I think the solution is not going back to the elitist view of that says that the fewer sources of information, the more you can trust these sources, but the appropriations we make of this information is what can lead us to a new and different and better society than the ones we have today. So some general issues that we can bring to this debate, and I hope we can continue this debate. Certainly. Nina, thank you very much. Nina mentioned very well this lack of trust in the traditional sources, the traditional media. This is a work we need to do, fighting fake news and all that, even from a point of view of regulation. We need to understand how all of this work, and using the information Professor Cláudio mentioned and the reforms that were promoted by in the funding system, and people question some of the role of the Superior Electoral Court in this process. So I want to ask Ministro Cardozo, how do you see the role of the judicial branch in this enhancement of our electoral system and our democracy? And how do you evaluate the current state of our democratic institutions? Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you, Felipe, for the great opportunity of being here with you, listening to Cláudio, Nina, and being participating with this opinion. This makes me very happy. This conversation and exchange of experiences is just great. Trying to answer your question, as we say, I want to look to the tree from the florist to then study the tree better, and trying to look from this point to the Brazilian reality. I want to say that we live in a world, uh, we have a crisis of the model of political exercise we have since the start of the 17th century with the Constitution of the United States. from the 18th century, 1797, the constitution in France, and the theory that talks about this. This model of exercising policy is going through a crisis, as all models at some point will go through a crisis. Why is it in a crisis? I'm not going to into that now, but I'm going to diagnose it. All the pillars of this government are in crisis. The principle of law is going through a crisis, uh, and democracy is in crisis. I wouldn't say that democracy is in crisis, but the model incorporated by this rule of law, which is the representativeness, is going through a crisis. And I would say this crisis is worldwide. And also for several different factors. Let's remember that we started from the supposition that way back in Greece we had democracy and a direct democracy, but that excluded part of the citizens. It included just part of the people there, and only those who could go there and raise their arms and vote, the agora. And then you have this idea of direct participation in political decisions by the government. But the fact is that democracy, we incorporate the model of representative democracy, because you can't have direct democracy in larger universes of voters. But this possibility is captured by the dominating parts of the society to try to conduct political will without the participation of some, or controlling the participation of those who have lower political expression. Let's remember the origin of the vote of women and other minorities, and then we go to the universal right to vote. So as Professor Cláudio says, we'll have more expensive campaigns, and the impossibility of direct democracy generates forms of control by the dominating structures and create contradictions.
You have to use manipulation mechanisms that are more sophisticated. And not using them don't it doesn't mean they don't exist. So what we have is a crisis today in which the web world has even caused it to be more difficult. Everything they do is people do is all shown live in real time. There's no country in the world in which we talk about politicians and they don't disqualify those politicians. They don't People don't feel represented in this democracy anymore, and it happens in such a way that we have to look at the forest and then we get back to the tree. We have specialists in this panel. Remember 2013 in Brazil, people on the streets were it all caught us by surprise. I remember I was there, and President Dilma was there as well. We were watching an attempt of breaking one of the branches, and one attempt of invasion of the House of Representatives. And I thought, well, they're going to get in here and kill us. And those responsible, and the Ministry of Defense was questioned and said, well, I cannot ask um, the SWAT like army to get in here and take care of this. I cannot just attack people. What is our rules? Well, we have to call the leaders and check what is happening. We had no leaders. We had no rules. Uh, we had contradicting claims from people on the streets. I was so surprised, and we started working to work on an answer for that, and we didn't even have We weren't even ready for that. Things came out of our mind because it was not all clear. The first thing, and one uh, that came from an IPEA study, it showed an inversion of social situation from the Lula government, the Brazilian leaving poverty slowly, but it was happening. They were starting to be inserted in society, but at the same time, a dissatisfaction from society was showing up. So that sensation of for middle class, for example, they were feeling they were getting poorer, and the poorer was getting richer, and this was causing a contradicting dissatisfaction. More people could have access, but access wouldn't happen because the social infrastructure wouldn't meet this demand. There was this bad temper that was generalized and everywhere because of the car wash operation, because corruption was being evidenced. Of course, we saw a fight against corruption, but we also saw some abuse in the sense further on. Uh, and also, above all, there was this dissatisfaction of the representation of democracy. People didn't feel represented. If they can define an end of a program, just like the Big Brother or similar, how come this person cannot define a policy or choose a representative wisely? If you add this all up to this dissatisfaction, you are going to see that in several parts of the world, this phenomenon happens. So from 2013, we entered an eruption of the representative democracy. And international and national sectors use this to attack a project of a country improvement we had in Brazil. Some will agree, some will not agree with what I'm saying, but this is it. This was used to fight everything that we were working with, starting with Lula in power, and continuing on with Dilma in power, but that was used against that uh, growth model. The impeachment with no responsibility uh, and the violation of constitutional democracy. We have become a laboratory of a crisis concerning rule of law. The political scientist in Brazil, for my sadness, is full of material to work. We see all branches invading themselves and interfering. And it is very paradoxical. It is paradoxical because sometimes it is progressive, but it incorporates humanistic values and homoaffective marriage, for example, is attacked, but it's all related to rights. There was this one jurist that said that once you open the box of the rule of law, you never know what is going to come out of there. You may have all sorts of birds in that cage. We have jurists and judges who promote statistics as a form of interpretation of the law, and this is serious when you think of the court branch is able to act majoritarily. But on the other side, we also have a perverse situation. Why is the rule of law weak? Because it doesn't run in a very fast pace. I remember Otto von Bismarck when he used to say that if people knew how laws and sausages were made, they would not consume either of them. But we are sausages. Our laws are sausages, and we need sausages and laws for all of this. And this is just stupid because the law doesn't respond to everything. But this mindset of the law resolves everything is in everyone's mind. This is the perverse reality that generates this sensation that the legislation branch will create the law, and it is just slow because the group takes time to vote and put it into effect. And what happens in Brazil is that we are trying to balance the political situation, and there is a responsibility, a crime that has to be checked every time an action is taken. And the governors are being attacked, and they are being destituted from their positions for crime of responsibility. As the Constitution says, democratically, we have an adequate system. And then I'll say, oh, people didn't want the parliamentarism. But the thing is, the rule is that democratic violence shouldn't happen. So this is the background. And in Brazil, it is potentializing all this radicalism. We are one tree in the forest, and we are representing all of the vices and problems of the forest at a very alarming pace. So how do we get away with this? I don't know. So we have a local crisis, but it's also within a global crisis. What I see it is the denial, the negation regarding all related to the rule-based democracy and the capitalist society. We see some advance, and it points toward a situation that is better when we consider the human relationship and values. But what I see, the authoritarianism is the return to the barbarian way of doing things. When we talk about the rule-based democracy, and we have a specialist here, is the digital democracy, we have to institutionalize a digital agoras to allow direct participation of population with no suppression of representative democracy, but creating a participatory democracy in which people use the internet for that purpose. How can we build this without the fake news and manipulations and robots? Or maybe from an elitist point of view, Umberto Eco would say that the internet gave voice to the imbecile, and it's the voice of imbecility. It is using this tool is being used for dogmation. If from one side the internet democratizes and socializes and points to a more agile democracy, one that uh, opens the space between the representative and their people. From another perspective, it brings dogmatization and imbecilization. So exactly. So I'd like to say to you that I have to be honest, I don't have an answer, but I think that the answer has to come from discussions that include democracy. So whatever comes next, I don't know. So we are looking for this answer, and this is why we are here today. Um, uh, I think that you have touched a few interesting points regarding the representative crisis of democracy, not only in Brazil, but everywhere in many other countries. We see this distance of relationship between the politicians and the population. So I think it's interesting what you said. All you say all pillars of democracy, of representative democracy, are at crisis. Nina also mentioned the disbelief of people regarding their institutions. So what I'd like to do now is to get back to Claudio again, to try, Claudio, to link everything you've said before regarding the mistrust of population regarding the politicians. What was left behind was a party reform that is so necessary for Brazil. So I would like to know from you, how do you think we can get back to the citizens trusting the politicians again and their representative? There are many solutions everywhere in the world. There are some nice initiatives of a more direct democracy, specifically in France. Here, I was talking to my research supervisor, Julia Cagé. She wrote The Price of Democracy. She proposes the electoral funding as a direct choice from the citizen, made by the citizen. And I think it is important to consider some of the initiatives from the world to reestablish this relationship. How do you think we can restore this trust with the political parties and include the citizens? Well, we now enter into another discussion, and as the minister said, what to do about the future, in a blind way, but with some hope. If you look back, and I think Nina knows this better than myself, because this is her area of expertise. If you look back into the promise of internet and social media, there was this promise of democracy with information. And I think that just just as mentioned by the minister, it works for some things, but works not so well for some other things. What I see now, just to say something more optimistic, what I see is, for example, I see some recent movements that are non-party movements. Some organizations are trying to bring a few things into politics, and the parties are not doing this. Considering the Brazilian context, in which you cannot have candidates that are not from a party, so you're having some political movements, and the parties are feeling this competition and responding to this sometime, and some people who do not like this sort of action, and they say, well, this should be done by the parties, when, well, the parties are not doing this.
So as an economist, and economists like competition, and we think that competition generates efficiency, I think the political parties, as they say in the United States, they're feeling the heat and they are responding, and eventually they will have to respond. The political parties will have to understand, and I'm talking about all the parties here, from the extreme right to the left. For example, PSOL doesn't want to accept candidates who are funded by people they don't like, and other parties doing the same. So you will have some kind of accommodation in the process, but in a way or another, the parties will have to respond to that. And there's no law or regulation controlling that. So the political parties will have to react and understand that they need to form new leadership and more democratic leaderships. And I think there's no way back in that sense. It may be this year the parties may not respond. There are very few black candidates, but I believe that in 2 years this response will be greater. I think it will happen, and due to a mixture of the pressure from these movements and from the social media. I think this would be an optimistic view. Another optimistic thing I see from outside is that I think that community leaders around Brazil, and that's where the social media have that has a negative effect, but might have a positive one, considering Twitter especially. In several slums around Brazil, the role of leadership where the government is not present was essential during the pandemics, for example. So trying to solve community problems by social action, it's very interesting at the local level. And I don't see why you couldn't use this movement, connecting it to what the minister said. For example, Brazil was one of the innovative countries, and many of the cities ruled by PT use participative budget. And we have several evidences in economy of positive effects of this participatory budget, but it didn't work in some points. It was taken over by some of the local elites. But the idea of this participatory budget and use of the direct democracy for making decisions regarding budget or definition of priority at local level with the use of the internet becomes a reality. So I think many innovations will come up regarding how to use that, and we have to be careful, as Ministro said, to how these medias are working and so that this process are not taken over, but the possibility of direct democracy for making decisions, it's clear every day. So eventually this is going to happen. How are the politicians going to respond? How are the institutions going to respond? That's the big question. So there's a recent research we're conducting with some friends, with 3 other economics, and we are looking at how the state representatives have reacted to that. We talk about internet 3G. It has spread slowly through Brazil, more in some cities than the others since 2007. And how do the representatives react? They interact much more often with their possible voters, but in terms of resources they send, like uh, bills they send to the Congress, they will send to places where they cannot communicate directly through internet because they don't have internet 3G in that location. So the representatives are reacting to the participation in Facebook, but they are looking at how they send the resources also. So how do you make these communications via social media, as Minister said? How do you do this real-time politics, reacting very quickly? How do you set that up in a way that you have accountability, that it's not only populism, quick reaction to what this or that person said? We see that all the time in the current government. Many decisions made by the Bolsonaro government, they seem to throw everything on the social media. If they complain a lot, they'll go back in their word. If there's no reaction, they will move on with what they've done. What they're doing is kind of like this. Let's throw this on Twitter. Let's see who complains, who says it's okay. We measure that. And we don't think this is how governance using technology should be like. This is cheap populism using this technology. This is the bad side of this, and this is not the way we want to move. Thank you, Cláudio. This thing you mentioned, I think it's very interesting, and I think it was great that you mentioned that digital media will reach places where government is not present, where the state is not there, and there is all this popular pressure on the situation. And Ministro also mentioned the crisis of 2013, and I want to throw a provocation that Tomás de Barros made here. He said something directed to Nina Santos, and he asks, are social digital media a reason for democratic hope or authoritarian despair? Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Tomás. I think that social media, in the sense of connection between people, they are certainly democratic hope. But social media, in the way they're being organized today, they can be democratic hope, but authoritarian despair. It depends on how you take over this environment. how we take hold of that. I want to respond to your provocations and some interesting points made by Minister Cardozo and by Cláudio. One thing I think it's very important for us to think about is that the same social media that in 2011 to 2013 were seen as the salvation of democracy because they would allow people who didn't have a voice might have access to public debate are the same media that in 2016 2018 have been accused by the results of Brexit and the election of Bolsonaro. Social media will not end or be the future of democracy. It's the way we use it that is important. We need to understand the relationship between policy and the media. You both have mentioned that the political process will clearly, in any kind of democracy, in any of its different models, it will never be as fast as digital communication. But that doesn't mean a dissatisfaction, a constant dissatisfaction of the citizenship, because the political world is not separate from the social world. You don't have the political world here in one side and the people reacting on the other, against or together. These things are intertwined. Both political parties and citizens are in the same digital world. So, in forming opinions, these different actors are essential, even in the digital environment. The thing is, no specific group detains the majority of this system. The authorities are not the only one that can express their opinion and influence other people's reaction. They have been stronger in the past, and today they have to share this space with other actors that might be more affected by imbecility, as Minister said, but they might also bring morality and diversity that you didn't see in the past. So the pressure so that some minority voice, in political terms, be it black people, women, or other minority groups, to bring their voices to the political sphere is important. And I think that it's very clear for me when you think of 2013. It's important that Minister Cardozo mentioned. First is the moment I studied there in my thesis. I had the opportunity of interviewing many people in the federal government. It was very interesting to hear what they had to say. And I lived through that moment. I remember the day we had the big protest and manifestation in Sao Paulo, received with great violence. It was a chaos in Sao Paulo. I was presently in one of the seminars called 10 years of the progressive governments in Brazil, celebrating all the advances we had. So I saw personally this fight between the advances that had been made and that new enhancement and this new social mobilization that had not been incorporated in this construction, this political construct. The way the debate is built, the way people are organizing themselves was clearly at that time separated there. I agree with Minister that these manifestations have been taken over by many other groups that had led everything to other directions that brought us to where we are today. But just trying to close and summarize this, when we think of technologies, communication technologies, it's essential that we first think of the appropriations made of these technologies and how the political world is part of this environment. And we need to think political organization going way spreading farther than the political sphere. We need to amplify our sense of institution. People are mobilizing through other means that are not traditional. And it's not only using through our traditional structures that we're going to be able to do that. This is a long debate, but these are some issues I want to present. Yes, using what you said about the institutions, we have a question from our audience, from Otávio de Barros, asking, in this ironic series to Ministro Cardozo, in this ironical way the institutions are working, if even the institutions in the United States, the traditional institutions, are being seriously affected, what can we say about all the setbacks we had in Brazil with the barbaric behavior and how it affects the democratic institutions? I want to ask Nina something first. I really want to read your thesis. Nina, if you can help me read your thesis, I thank you very much. I'm very curious to see your approach. I don't know how you're going to be able to help me with your thesis, but I would really like to read it. This question brings a lot of trouble. The matter is, has the world ever, uh, from the idea of the common sense of people, did the world ever uh, ignored authoritarianism or barbaric behaviors? I think this is permanent. If you look at the 20th century and what happened during that century, all the advances we've made, overcoming many issues, the affirmation of democracy that we saw there, the universal vote we had, the same way we had setbacks. All the coups we saw affecting democracy, all the authoritarian government with Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, General Franco in Spain, Salazar in Spain. This is a historical period. Democracy suffers hits and attacks. You have the storm of the social state. The idea of capital or bourgeois state or something, it suffers, it is affected by some attacks, and with the negation, for example, of the capitalistic society and the rule of law, the attempts to negate that, when you have, for example, the Mexican Constitution of 1917, the Constitution of Weimar in 1919, and you have other authoritarian governments, you have go back to the social state, and now we have a crisis in the new times. This might be final in historic terms, the way we talk about this. Democracy is going through a crisis. The power is at crisis, all this that we mentioned. And the fight between representative and direct democracy are clear. For example, you mentioned very properly the participative budgets. I had the honor of being the municipal secretary of the first woman who ever be the mayor of São Paulo, Luísa Erundina, and my life was marked by being, with honor, subordinate to a woman. I was the secretary of Luísa Erundina. I was the minister of the first woman president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. So during the government of Luísa Erundina, I felt that in myself. We had a great group of secretaries. I was very young at the time. I was 27. I was working with secretaries like Paulo Freire, who was responsible for education. I had the privilege of being his friend and learning with him every day. A culture secretary like Marilena Chauí or Paulo Singe, Dalmo Dallari, we had a group of secretaries that was fantastic and even scary, but they all had a perspective of enhancing democracy. And we were not able to apply participatory budget in São Paulo because of the sheer size of the country. Cities like Porto Alegre had better advancements, but always with reaction from participatory democracy. The city representatives did not accept this participatory budget. And we'll have these fights more and more often in the future. Representatives don't want to give space to direct democracy. You can see how rarely we use referendums and plebiscites to see the quantitative participation of the population when creating new laws. There is a very short and few events like that in our history. We're living in a moment with great activity. You have the suppression of the democratic form, like you saw in the 20th century with authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. So you have always this questioning and this debate regarding the rule of law. I'm a person that believes that men and women create their future. I don't believe in destiny. I think they build it through their interactions. I think we have to have our path to utopia very clear, though the horizon seems to be very dark. Way back in the 14th century, during the Spanish flu, we couldn't see what that would represent to the European continent. We didn't have any explanation of the past. We didn't see how it was going to affect the feudal system, recreate a new form of economic production, or how it would affect all the institutions in Europe. We couldn't tell. And when you have the formation of absolute states and several states, except for England in Europe, we had a situation that nobody could believe it would lead to the negation of the rule of law. But many thinkers indicated the rule of that. They were already going, fighting history on that. That's why they talk about that in England, considering the transformation that religion had brought to England, to defining some points of view.
Not wrongly, Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of Law and preparing the terrain for the future, despite the interest of the royals. La Volonté Générale was also written with a perspective of in inserting the idea of estimation of power. Everything was being forged from historical experiences and influencing history. So our role is, as far as we understand what is good, or what we understand that is adequate, from our point of view, this represents what represents the best interest is our building of our own future. So probably Nina's thesis could be some sort of embryo for a future democratic model considering the digital, of a reflection that is probably going to develop in the future. We are probably developing a new model to transform. I think that this is what we have to have clear in our mind, how to conduct processes, to fight for the processes, and not only sit and watch of everything we are living today. We need to have the historical courage to fight the authoritarism. And it's worth mentioning, when you look at a government just like Bolsonaro's in Brazil, of course, this has some evidence. There are some ridiculous initiatives, and so absurdly ridiculous, and so unbalanced to what we consider reasonable. They are so insane that we are all the time in a debate. We are just discussing what the stupidities that are happening. It's hard to see and to point what has to be corrected, using the idea of new models and for them to be created. We are debating stupidities and not noticing that these have to be solved not by the ridicularization of such stupidity, but with the creation of models to prevent this from happening. This is the historical challenge we have today. And the same thing is happening in the United States and Trump. We have to put our minds into action. We need to function. We need to act. And this is what I see we have to do during this historical moment. Exactly. Thank you very much, Minister. Now we are about to end our debate. I just would like to run another round of final considerations. We maybe 3 minutes each, so that you can summarize how we can move toward this strengthening of institutions in Brazil and how we can improve uh, the way we run our elections, and talking about digital democracy, and in case of Minister Cardozo, the institutions as a whole, and with Professor Ferraz, how we can bring more evidence to public policy in this improvement. I'd like you to talk about these themes so that we can end this debate. Do I start, Felipe? Yes, you can start. Okay. In fact, what I'll say now is that I don't have the word for this. I think it's impossible to think of the future in Brazil, and the word is education. I think it is of utmost importance when we think of Brazil. And I'm not talking about education as education going to school, but bringing ideas into school, ideas of democracy, civil society, participation. It is impossible to think that the next generation of Brazilians and young people who could participate in elections at the age of 16, how can we form, train, teach these people? And the way we do it is just so disconnected from politics and so civil participation in society and community sense. I do see education, and I am not saying of anything about a civic traditional education, just the way it was established in the 50s. I am talking about modern ways of raising awareness of young people so that they understand they live in society and how this can influence. We see protests, and getting back to 2013, or a phenomenon you can see, especially in Latin America, of everything that is happening in Chile now. This part of what the young people or future citizens can how they can act as civilians, how can we insert them into society? And I'm talking about things such as how to know if news are fake or not, how to see evidences like this, how to think of statistics, how to think of society as it is, how to vote. These are things that are taught very superficially at school. And considering a high school reform that was carried out in Brazil, I want to teach the young people to get into the market, but we don't teach them how to enter and be part of a society. Of course, working is important, training is important, studying is important, because we all need to work. But as important as this is the insertion of the young people into the society. So thinking of education in this context is fundamental. Perfect, Professor Claudio. Nina? Well, I will end by raising two issues. One is came in this discussion, and another one is going to be mentioned just now. I think it is important, just to summarize, we need to think of this digital environment and the political possibilities, whether they are good or bad as something that is done, created by us. We are responsible for this environment. Many times when we think of the political debate, we enter a discussion that is too technical and too determinist of what the platform may do to us or for us. We need to think of what we can do with such platforms as an elector, as a civilian, as a part of society. So with this, I don't mean societies, the platforms should not be liable, and I don't mean they don't have any influence. On the contrary, this is a debate we have not addressed here, but I think we should consider the liability of each platform and how they take part in the political discussion. I think that we are now leaving the center of journalism. They do still exist. We have several other mediators, but we don't have any transparency on how uh, many of the institutions work. We don't know how the internet organizes the contents that are circulated, and these platforms have an essential role on how the public debate works today. So discussing the platforms is essential so that we have a truly democratic society. But on the other side, our responsibility, our role within these environments is important. And I think that when we think of this political system and the uh, civilians and citizens who have voice, we need to, it's not about increasing and opening for the voice and for them to talk, and we cannot think of this as a fetish. I think that both Minister Cardozo and Cláudio, we look at Brazil, we can mention several cases that listening to people, uh, opening for discussion sometimes won't solve the problem. We need ways to include people, but we need to qualify this debate and qualify the political opinion. Education is definitely essential, not only the incorporation of what is said within this environment, but we need to make these environments part of the political education, and therefore they are going to be taking part of political decisions in the country. That is perfect. Okay, just seamless. Now, Minister Cardozo, well, I would like to thank for the opportunity of taking part of this. And from everything I've heard from you, I am leaving this panel with some homework to do. The first one is I need to rethink democracy from the vices it presents today so that it's not suppressed. This is the first homework for us all here, considering the vices of the rule of law and the technological evolution and everything that was mentioned here. Second task, estamos com problemas, we are facing a few problems. And considering education not only as an institutional space, such as schools and universities, but considering education uh, as uh, a means of operation from people. We all think we have our point of view, and many times we just fault when we have some very strong convictions. Instead of developing criticism, we develop standpoints. You are not going to tear a book, not even the worst one. You have to read them before you start criticizing them. The way to defeat an idea, you have to think of that. And you cannot just say it is just forbidden or bad. Unfortunately, we still have the habit of people uh, selecting what to read. Well, read everything. You need to develop your criticism. You need to fight the dogma because you need to challenge yourself. Education is challenge for this perspective. And it's not killing the messenger or the sender. because I understand this or that is wrong. So ourselves as citizens, we have to fight against intolerance and within our own environment, because sometimes we still have contradicting ideas within ourselves and within our environment. And when we act authoritarianly, you treat the person next to you as an object. You need to understand that there is another person there in front of you that may think differently from you. And these are tasks that I'm going to carry out after this debate. And I thank you very much for this immense and great debate. Of course, I'd love to be in Paris there to be talking to you, of course, to live and talk to you. And well, next time I'm going to be there to have some great wine with you and Canale L'Orange, which I adore. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And Nina, please don't forget to send me, don't forget to forward your thesis so that I can read. So once again, I'd like to thank the three of you and thank you, my audience, for being here with us in this debate on elections and institutions. Is just so important, especially because we are just a few weeks from the elections and also because it's a theme that is very linked to the 2030 agenda. I like you bringing the perspective of education, and you've demanded so that we can talk. We are going to have a panel on education on November 10th, and our conference is now continuing. We have a debate on the future of labor on Tuesday. We are going to have 13 panels total up until the 5th of December, all Tuesdays and Saturdays. So thank you very much once again for taking part of this debate. It was an honor and a great pleasure as a Sciences Po student. It was a privilege to listen to you and a privilege for our audience as well. So I'll thank you very much and I'll see you soon.